Now, the week in Westminster with Michael White.
Tragedy is an unpredictable teacher. I arrived at Westminster early on Thursday to be told John Smith was ill. Within minutes I heard he was probably dead. In the next few hours, many of us saw and heard things which were both distressing and moving. Grown men embracing each other, lost for words. People I'd always seen as tough guys. Shadow Foreign Secretary Jack Cunningham, for example, close to tears on camera. The tributes in both Houses of Parliament, led by John Major, were unusually heartfelt, so most people agreed, and they gave some inkling. Here's the ubiquitous John Prescott, dashing between studios, talking about a man very different from himself, whom he evidently admired, and usually referred to in private as Old Smithy.
He was a politician that stood for something. He had courage, he stood for conviction, he had integrity, he had honesty, decency. These are words that trip off the tongues of politicians when they want to give homage to people at these particular times. But this man really deserved it. It was remarkable to hear all those things this week said by people from different political perspectives. But what was unique about them all? They all spoke of a personal experience with John Smith. That was the strength of the man.
Now, various people have said he was a sort of collegiate leader, a bit like Clement Attlee, rather quiet, not a great egotist, but kept a lot of warring egos in check around the cabinet table, in your case, the shadow cabinet table. How did Smith operate in that room under Big Ben where you all meet on Wednesday afternoons once a week?
He was a tough operator, but he'd listen to views, but sometimes he would feel, I don't agree with you there, and very toughly attack the person making that particular point of view. He could be very harsh. But at the end of the day, he always made those people feel as if we were all one of a team. He'd have a drink with them afterwards, and it didn't fester on any disagreements.
One of your colleagues said, if you worked closely with John, sooner or later you had a row with him, and it was quite a serious row. He told this person telling me, he told me that I was taking up space and I shouldn't raise an issue which was controversial and would do no good, but we didn't fall out over it. Now, that consistent with your experience?
Sounds like Jack Straw.
Well, I'm unable to reveal my sources, Mr. Prescott.
But I'm sure Jack used to have some clashes with him. I used to have some clashes with him, but that was the nature of John. You didn't go away feeling hurt about it. He'd strongly argue his case, and he would say, I think that's a bit of daft nonsense that you're pursuing at the present time. But if you continued to pursue it, he didn't conduct a vendetta against you. That was the nature of the man. He'd say, right, well, you've got your political case to deploy, but you're going to know where I stand with you. I'll tell you what, if you've been told off by John Smith, you've been told off. What you did after that, well, it was up to you, but he understood there were different spirits and different views in the party, and he was a leader that had to try and bring them all together, and he used to allow an awful lot of licence for that.
You listen and you hear them talking not just about politics and policy, but about family walks stretching back over 20 years, personal kindnesses, late-night glasses of malt whisky, and you realise that behind the politician as public man is a hinterland the public rarely sees. John Smith wasn't a great one for matiness with Conservatives, but even Michael Heseltine revealed this week that after his own heart attack in Venice last year, the Labour leader took the trouble to send him a good luck note. So, a useful reminder that politicians really are like the rest of us. If you prick them, they bleed real blood. But Thursday's distress was not confined to the political elite worrying about its own mortality. Outside Westminster Tube Station, for example, a sign appeared reading, "The staff of this station extend their deepest sympathy," and so on. One of many such small gestures I heard about, which nowadays are usually reserved for sports stars and rock musicians. In a supposedly hard-boiled age, cynical and fearful, we are constantly told, did it, I wonder, signal a wistful desire to return to solider civic virtues, to the old-fashioned self-confident decencies which Smith was coming to embody in the public mind? I put this point to Peter Mandelson, Labour MP for Hartlepool, former party communications director and a famous, some would say notorious, scientist of the public mood.
I think that what it tells us about public feeling is that there is an overwhelming desire for change, for an alternative from the present government and the present direction of the country, and people saw that in what John Smith stood for and the direction in which he was taking the Labour Party and the direction in which he would take the country. And I think also it shows just how far John Smith tapped into a huge well of public support for the things that he put forward most vigorously. His belief in economic opportunity, getting people back to work, his very deep conviction and belief in the need to bring back social justice to our country.
Social justice and efficiency not being incompatible at all, that's what he was saying.
Absolutely, absolutely. What he would say is, fair is efficient. giving people life chances, giving them the opportunity to put into society, to help in the process of generation of wealth and to take out. But I think also something that John made particularly his own, and that was to do with integrity and ethics in government. He thought that the sleaziness of government, the corruptness of government in the broader sense of the term, was something that showed how very badly wrong things had gone in the country. He believed for an alternative, and I think people saw in John Smith a personal honesty and integrity, and that is what they would like to see embodied in whoever continues in the leadership of the party.
Yeah, we talked about qualities of the next leader. You're not going to discuss individual candidates with me today, I suspect.
No, I'm not.
But in broad terms, a younger leader, a less experienced leader in every way, by definition, whoever wins, what are they going to need to have in terms of personal qualities and to do in order to keep the Labour Party an effective fighting force, riding high in the polls?
I think that what the party will be looking for is really what the country looks to in its future Prime Minister. That's somebody who is good at the box office. Somebody who's going to bring in not only the regular customers who have traditionally supported the Labour Party, but who are going to bring in new voters, new supporters, people perhaps who haven't looked to the Labour Party recently, people who fell out of the habit of voting for Labour and whose support we need again.
Southern customers.
Southern customers, Midlands customers, customers all over. People in the north as well, where my constituency is, many of whom right up until and including the last election, couldn't quite make that jump to supporting the Labour Party. I think, secondly, it's somebody who is going to maintain John's vigour in putting across with real clarity and real conviction what the modern Labour Party stands for, its enduring values and how those are expressed and how those are applied in the policies that it's putting forward for the 1990s. And I think, thirdly, and not least, is somebody who will galvanise the party, somebody who will inspire and unite the party. And I think in all these three senses, the broad appeal to those voters whose support we need at the next election, that clarity and conviction, but also that ability to inspire and unite the party, that's what the party will be looking for, quite rightly.
Right. On a practical note, people listening will have forgotten the mechanics of a Labour leadership contest whenever it comes, July or October. And in any case, the rules have been changed during the 2 years since John Smith took over. Remind us again of how the party actually goes about it.
Well, of course, the rules have been changed as a result of the changes that John Smith
the Omov battle of last October.
The great Omov battle. And that is a great testimony to John's leadership, and it will be a lasting one, because what John argued for and won the day on was that it's the individual members of the party, individual levy-paying members of trade unions, as well as individual members of the Parliamentary Labour Party who should have the say in the vote, and they will do so when the time comes to elect his successor.
So there is an electoral college of three groups, now with equal shares, no longer 40% for the unions, 33, 33, 33. MPs and MEPs vote as individuals, obviously. Party members, not party activists, all vote in the constituencies. Is this right? And then the unions, what do they do?
The trade unions will have to ballot, and they'll have to ballot those amongst their ranks who are associated with the Labour Party. You're in a sense running an almost American-style primary. It will be intensely democratic. It will be intensely open to the public glare. I think that's very healthy, because the public will take a great interest in it and will be engaging with us in that debate and in that election. But that, of course, places a demand on the Labour Party to carry out that election in sad circumstances and in a disciplined and in a united way.
What's your instinct, July or October? What's best?
I don't know which way the NEC will go, but I think up and down the country what the party will want is a leader in place by the summer who will be able to put forward his stamp and his authority for the party conference in the autumn, and he'll need the summer to do that.
Peter Mandelson. It's hard to remember what the political agenda was before Thursday morning. Ah, yes, that European referendum row and John Smith's last outburst over Minister Nicholas Scott's role in the Civil Rights Disabled Persons Bill. We'll get to that in a moment. I had planned to talk referendums with, among others, Tony Benn, a veteran opponent of what he would call a narrow, centralised and undemocratic vision of Europe. In the circumstances, Mr. Benn preferred to deploy his long memory to talk about Mr. Smith, once his former junior minister at Energy in the 70s.
Well, I thought the House was very generous. The Prime Minister made a very fine tribute, paid a fine tribute, and Margaret Beckett made a very good speech, and others joined in. And what I think came across so clearly was the character of the man, because in the end, you know, it isn't whether you agree with somebody it matters, whether you trust them. And there are some people that I agree with but might not trust, and others I disagree with very strongly, but I do trust. And I thought it was the trust in the character of John that emerged strongly.
They were saying, in effect, here's a good parliamentarian.
Not just a good parliamentarian. I don't even know that. A good man, really. I mean, a good man who happened to be in Parliament. But I think what's really happened, of course, is that he's articulated very clearly the desire of the British people to turn their back on the 80s in much the same way as Clem articulated the desire of the people of 45 to turn their back on the 30s.
That's Clem Attlee for you.
Clem Attlee, for those who don't remember him. And he had very qualities similar to Clem, you see. I mean, after all, Clem appointed key people in his cabinet who'd been expelled from the party. Stafford Cripps had been expelled, and Nye Bevan had been expelled. He put Stafford Cripps in the Treasury and Nye Bevan at the Department of Health. And Smith was the same. The healing process since he became leader had been very, very marked. He had not fought sectarian battles in the party at all. He simply concentrated his attention on the other side and put forward with conviction his own vision of a better future. And I think it's for that he'll be remembered, and why it's going to be difficult to find a replacement.
But you're saying that he didn't pick fights with
not at all. Not and when you heard Dennis Skinner get up, and everyone feels the same. That tribute he wrote for Bob Cryer was very much a figure of the left. He said he'd like to have been at his funeral in Bradford the other day, but he couldn't, so he sent this lovely message. And I think we've got to the point, really, when the old battles of the last 10 years have got to be put behind us, and we've got to heal the wounds and unite together. And that will contribute to our electoral
You're going to be
victory.
able to do this. We've got a leadership contest there always. I know you're a great man for elections. They're a healing process, but they do have a downside.
I don't think so, really. It's not as if it's somebody trying to stand against somebody who's already there. This is a vacancy, and people put up to fill a vacancy. I would be very surprised if there was any ill will. I think you'll find that it'll lead to a highly desirable, though tragic, opportunity to discuss the direction in which the party's going and to the extent to which we should commit ourselves about the future and how the party should work and so on. And it may be that when the new leader is elected, it'll turn out that John's final legacy to us was to give us the chance to have a discussion about how we should go to bring us closer.
There wasn't really enough of one after Neil Kinnock stepped down, was there? There was a terrible shock.
Well,
John was elected on the rebound. Would you concur with that? Brian Gould didn't really get much of a show.
No, it was very strange and different in the aftermath of the fourth consecutive defeat. But now this is on the eve of the first of 4 consecutive victories. You said, I mean, there's all the difference in the world.
You said a moment ago that there's a terrible vacuum to fill, but you're famous for insisting that individuals may give the roar. I think you quoted Nelson Mandela as being someone who gave the roar but didn't really get rid of apartheid. You say movements and groups of people and collective action is what changes history.
I think so. That's how women got the vote. It wasn't because of Mrs. Pankhurst. That's how the Chartists won. It wasn't because of the Chartist leaders. That's how the Berlin Wall came down. That's how apartheid ended, with popular movements. And I heard Churchill himself, when we paid a tribute to him, I think on his 80th birthday, saying, "The British public were the lion. I was privileged to give the roar."
Yes,
now, you see, that is a modest but correct interpretation of the role of leadership.
But some of us think that's both you and Mr. Churchill playing down your respective roles. You as an individual have been immensely, dramatically important in the development of the Labour Party. That individuals, you've said it about John Smith, rather more important than that. And there's a big choice for the Labour Party ahead, and it's not clear to many people quite how it's going to proceed here and who it's going to proceed with, because the personality does matter, doesn't it? You said so yourself.
Well, I think I would like to quote my favourite quotation about leadership, Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher. He said, "As to the best leaders, the people do not notice their existence. The next best, the people honour and praise. The next best, the people hate. The next best, the people fear. But when the best leader's work is done, the people say, we did it ourselves."
Tony Benn. That South African reference leads us indubitably to the week's larger event. On Wednesday, Nelson Mandela became President of South Africa. Upward of 20 British MPs joined troops of international observers at the elections. Having seen such innocents abroad in the Third World, I'm sometimes sceptical about their usefulness in villainous circumstances, though in the Philippines I did once see John Hume, who does know a stuffed ballot box when he sees one, deliver a shrewdly damning verdict on the late Ferdinand Marcos. But among South Africa's British visitors was one with undeniable credentials. Former Young Liberal and now Labour MP for Neath, Peter Hain, a political exile for most of his life. How had he felt about what was only his second return home?
It was an extraordinary moment, and I say that I almost felt like crying throughout the week, just watching this extraordinary transformation from an oppressive tyranny, one of the most oppressive racist tyrannies the world's ever known, suddenly a flowering of democracy and goodwill. The thing that struck me was whites actually were believing in it, and they were saying, police officers were coming up to me and saying, shaking me by the hand and saying, you know, it's good to see you here. These people would have...
People tried to frame you for a bank robbery once, didn't they?
They did indeed. They did indeed. They sent me a letter bomb as well, and yet the goodwill was extraordinary.
Nelson Mandela in jail, what, since '64? You were a child then, I suppose. Did you ever imagine Mandela would be the president of South Africa?
Completely unimaginable. It's the equivalent of saying that we'd all be living on Mars. I was brought up at a time when my mother was actually giving food parcels to Nelson Mandela when he was on trial in Pretoria. She used to go along to the court and salute him, the only white so to do at that stage, from the gallery. And that was an awful, bitter time when people, including my parents, were jailed, they were banned, people were killed, people had their lives wasted away, and suddenly you get this miraculous, dream-like transformation, which I have to keep pinching myself to feel it was true.
Now, you were there to do a job of work, which was monitor these elections as part of the international community. It's a ritual of the modern world that people fly in from outside. I sometimes wonder whether they can do any good. Tell us what you did.
Well, there is a question as to whether international observers are on any more than kind of decorative freebies for an electoral process. But what I think our real value was, and I sensed this myself, is as a deterrent. Frankly, as you wander into a polling station or observe counting, you can't be sure that the whole process is going as it ought to be. And indeed, we found out the shenanigans that were happening behind the scenes, the logistical cock-ups and so on. But what really struck me about it, and you have you have a sixth sense for this as a political operator, is it was almost painfully democratic. People were taking great pains to make sure it was fair and free.
Where were you exactly?
I was in and around Johannesburg, in Soweto, in white suburbs, in Benoni.
You were travelling around all day in a convoy or on your own with a policeman and a jeep? Or?
I was on my own in a car with a fellow parliamentarian from Lesotho, as it happened. My driver recognised me, couldn't believe it was me, thought it was a ghost was in his car, and we had a terrific reunion. I'd never met him before, but that was wonderful. But we would go along, introduce ourselves, and go around and meet everybody. And what also struck me was the way that in Carter and the ANC, who'd been killing each other, there you'd find the party agents chatting to each other, the National Party, which had been their oppressors for generations, white National Party agents chatting to them, almost willing the process to be successful. Well, not almost, they were. They were willing it to be successful. They were joyously doing so. And I thought to myself, here are these whites actually engaging themselves in the process of destroying their own power and privilege.
Indeed. How much of a honeymoon has Nelson Mandela got?
I think he's got a considerable honeymoon because he's so respected, and I can't think of anybody else who could have accomplished this transformation and have such trust in doing so. Ex-President de Klerk deserves a lot of credit as well, but Mandela is somebody everybody looks up to in almost a reverential fashion.
Peter Hain. Right, now back to vulgar party politics and that disablement bill. It's not unusual for private members' bills to generate great passion among MPs on Fridays, or for ministers to contrive to have such bills waylaid and strangled by the footpads in the whip's office. It is unusual for an old hand like Nick Scott, the disablement minister, to get caught out. Here he is last Friday, answering Labour's Dale Campbell-Savers' direct challenge about government involvement in 80 late amendments, plainly designed to prevent the bill's all-party backers getting it through third reading.
Has he or anyone in his department in any way been involved in the drafting of these amendments?
No part whatsoever in the drafting of any amendments. To the best of my knowledge, nobody in my department has been involved in the drafting of any amendments in this area.
Keyword drafting, and here he is making his personal statement on Tuesday after it had been confirmed that yes, Parliamentary Council, the subterranean lawyers on the Westminster wordface, had indeed drafted amendments for 4 Tory MPs.
My statement on Friday that my department had not drafted any amendments was true. As I explained in a letter to the Honourable Member for Workington, the department, with my authority, had been involved in their preparation. I therefore felt that I should offer this clarification of my remarks to the House as a whole. I very much regret that by not giving a fuller explanation at the time, the effect of my reply was misleading, and I offered my unreserved apologies to the House.
Fishy business there from an undeniably popular minister. But then, like the tobacco advertising bill, which fought its way through the Commons yesterday, Labour MP Roger Berry's disablement bill has widespread support from MPs in all parties. One such supporter is Alan Howarth, a Conservative MP for Stratford-on-Avon, a former minister and a discerning one. How had Nick Scott got into such hot water?
It was a very scratchy atmosphere in the chamber. There was genuine anger in the chamber. We're used to synthetic anger, the ritualised anger that we often hear at question time, but members of Parliament on both sides were actually very angry indeed about what was happening to the Civil Rights Disabled Persons Bill. And the Minister was under very great pressure. Certainly I was startled that he said what he said, but
Because you thought that everyone knew that...
Well, it certainly seemed to us fairly obvious that the backbenchers who had tabled amendments were operating in a concerted way to talk this bill out. And I was, of course, angry about that. But let me say that I have the very highest regard for Nick Scott as Minister for Disabled People. Nobody could have a better track record than he's had as a minister. Everybody, I think, is agreed in their hearts across the parties, and certainly among the disablement pressure groups and among disabled people in this country, that we have a minister who's very seriously committed to their cause and in their interests. And I think it's most unfortunate. He made a mistake. He came to the House quickly and apologised at the beginning of the next week. And what we do in our other dealings in life is when somebody apologises, we accept the apology, particularly if it's a person we respect and particularly if it's a friend. And disabled people should certainly regard Nick Scott as a friend.
Well, it's curious that, rather as with the death of John Smith, that if someone has a good reputation as a good Parliament man and a good minister, they get a great deal of credit across the parties. That's what you seem to be saying about Nick Scott. But Labour backbenchers were saying, hang on a minute, here was a minister who seemed deliberately to have misled the House, comes and apologised. Surely that doesn't make it OK, because otherwise ministers will get into the habit of this. And there is a feeling, after many years in power, that perhaps ministers and officials cut corners with Parliament more than they did before.
I'm quite sure that Nick Scott didn't deliberately mislead the House. He did mislead the House. He misled the House in a situation in which he was under very great pressure in the House. A lot of anger all around, as I say. It was an error of judgment, but I'm quite certain that it was inadvertent, and I think it should be accepted as such. Of course, as a member of Parliament, I perfectly well understand why the opposition parties are making the most of this episode, but I don't actually think that it would be in any way fair or proper if Nick Scott were to be hounded out of office, and I'm sure that he won't be, and I think the Speaker's ruling and the Prime Minister's declaration on his behalf make it very clear that he won't be.
Now, tell me about this bill. You said there was a great anger in the House. I was there for part of the time. Yes, there was. But ministers say here's a private member's bill produced on a ballot, which is going to cost £17 billion to implement and £1 billion a year. A lot of money.
That's part of what I'm very displeased about, this compliance cost assessment that the government very belatedly produced.
Didn't give
alleging
that
the costs would be £17 billion is a most unsatisfactory document, produced in a most unsatisfactory way. It was quietly placed in the library of the House only the day before, the last day before we were due to debate this bill at report stage. That day, the Thursday, happened to be local election day when there were virtually no MPs at Westminster. None of us debating the bill the next day on the Friday were actually even aware that the document had been placed in the House.
Didn't it?
It should have been. Yes. It should have been provided to the House for the committee stage, and what's more, in itself, it is unsatisfactory. I was really fairly dismayed to see that although it was produced for us after committee stage was completed, it didn't actually take account of a very important amendment that Roger Berry, the sponsor of the bill, tabled during committee stage, which made it quite clear that the timescale for compliance with the requirements of the bill could be extended well beyond 5 years. Indeed, might be 20 years or more, and it's left at the discretion of the government. So it's very important not to suggest that this £17 billion cost is suddenly going to be laid all at once on the shoulders of employers. Most important that they shouldn't take alarm.
Alan Howarth, and incidentally Dennis Skinner's Commons tribute to John Smith, ended on a brilliantly opportunist note. He suggested that instead of adjourning for the day, the House should honour the lost leader by staying behind and passing the Berry Bill unanimously. You must have noticed in the past few days there's been a formal agenda, public tributes to Mr. Smith, and an informal one, who should be the next Labour leader. Few Labour MPs are yet prepared to discuss this in public, but that won't last. And meanwhile, let's give the last word this week to John Smith himself, speaking last summer as John Major, like that Scarborough Hotel, hovered on the brink.
I select but a few of the Prime Minister's recent triumphs. The billions of pounds lost in the panic and fiasco of Black Wednesday. The grievous damage to our energy resources which the disastrous pit closures programme has inflicted upon this country. The shady double-dealing in the metric structural affair. The hopelessly bungled scandal of the education tests. And the disaster waiting to happen in the privatisation of our railways. And in response to the plummeting popularity of the administration and of himself, revealed at Newbury and in the Shire County elections, we have the Prime Minister's botched reshuffle. If we were to offer this tale of events to the BBC Light Entertainment Department as a script for a programme, I think the producers of Westminster would have turned it down as hopelessly over the top. I think it might have even been too much, for some mothers do have them. But, Madam Speaker, the tragedy for us all is that it is really happening. It is fact, not fiction. The man with the non-Midas touch is in charge. No wonder we live in a country where the Grand National doesn't start an hotel. Well, the Grand National doesn't start and hotels fall into the sea.
The late John Smith on the top of his form. Goodbye.
The Week in Westminster was presented by Michael White, the political editor of The Guardian. The producer was Dennis Sewell. Up to 500,000 people could have been wrongly advised to leave their company or occupational pension and take up a personal plan. This week, the chief city watchdog ordered the insurance companies to compensate the victims. You can hear more in half an hour in Moneybox.